Happy Midnight Sun release week. I have something very fun planned for today's video. We're going to be talking about Bram Stoker's Dracula and how it has influenced different YA vampire media. The first thing we're going to be talking about is Bram Stoker's Dracula, which was written in 1897. I read this 3 years ago, so bear with me. The next thing we're going to be talking about is Stephenie Meyer's Twilight books, the first of which came out in 2005. Then we're going to be talking about the Vampire Diaries. I will mainly be focusing on the show as I have not read the books. Last but not least, we're going to be looking at Cassandra Clare's vampires in the Mortal Instruments series, which started coming out in 2007. First up, we're going to talk about kind of surface level similarities between the depictions of vampires in all of these series. Dracula and Twilight. The physical descriptions of vampires in Dracula and Twilight are very similar. They are described as cold, strong, pale, beautiful, with voices like twinkling glass. They have to die to become vampires. They have immortality and red eyes. Likewise, Dracula is shown to have some telepathic abilities similar to Edward, but that is the exception, not the rule in Twilight. Also, it's worth noting that vampires in Twilight sparkle, whereas they do not in Dracula. Another similarity between Dracula and Twilight is that the main girl has many suitors. In Twilight, Bella has Edward, Jacob, Mike, Tyler. Pretty much every male at Forks High trying to date her. In Dracula, we have Lucy, who is being courted by Arthur, Seawald, and Quincy. Both of these works also contain a scene where there are 3 vampire ladies trying to seduce one innocent human male. In Twilight, this is Jasper in his origin story with Maria and her friends. In Dracula, this is Jonathan. In Dracula, Dr. Seawald describes how people will eventually come to be repelled by vampires, similar to the way that Jacob thinks he will be repulsed by Bella once she becomes a vampire. And lastly, this is kind of a silly one, but there are Bellas in both series, as Bela Lugosi played the very first Dracula in the movie. And, of course, there's Bella Swan in Twilight. Next, we're going to be talking about Dracula and the Vampire Diaries. In both series, you have to stake a vampire or decapitate them in order to kill them, unlike in Twilight, where you have to burn a vampire to kill them. They both kind of have a sexy element. There's the fangs, the immortality, the fact that you have to be invited inside in order to enter. Something kind of cool is that Dracula is shown to be able to control the weather and some elements as well as some animals. And in the pilot episode for the Vampire Diaries, Damon is shown to be able to control a raven and the fog. I also think it's worth noting that Dracula's telepathic skills are kind of similar to the compulsion scene in Vampire Diaries. And lastly, we have Dracula and the City of Bones. Dracula lives in a castle, which I think is kind of similar to the Hotel du Mort. Other similarities between the depictions of vampires is that they are nocturnal, they have fangs, they have immortality. Additionally, they are both repelled by sacred items such as a crucifix and running water. This one's kind of interesting. Both Dracula and the Mortal Instruments have allusions to Scholomance, which is a school, and they both overlook a lake. In the City of Bones, the Scholomance is where shadow hunters go to become better shadow hunters. And in Dracula, it's a devil school in Transylvania. Next thing I want to talk about, real briefly, is how the vampires turn into vampires and where the vampires come from, where they originate from. In Dracula, it doesn't go into detail about how these vampires turn into vampires. In Twilight, you have to get bit and then let the venom spread. In the Vampire Diaries, you have to be bit and then die while the venom is in your system, and then you have to feed to complete the transition. In the Mortal Instruments, you have to either get bit or drink from a vampire, die, be buried, claw your way up, and then feed to complete the transition. I also think it's worth noting that there is a sire bond between the vampire and the vampire who sired them in Vampire Diaries as well as the Mortal Instruments. However, in the Vampire Diaries, it's seen as rare, but very intense. Intense loyalty. Whereas in the Mortal Instruments, everyone has a sire bond, but it's just very faint and you only feel pain when they die. As for origins, again, Dracula doesn't really go into the origins of the vampire species. In Twilight, Edward proposes that he thinks that vampires were created by God, just as he creates predator and prey species. In the Vampire Diaries, a witch created the vampires, and then their lineage just goes throughout history. In the Mortal Instruments, vampirism is caused by a demon disease. Now we're going to start to dig a little bit deeper, and we're going to be talking about narration and how that makes us, as the readers, feel about the vampires. We're going to start with Dracula. Dracula is an epistolary novel, which means it's told in letters and documents and diary entries, but we never get Dracula's point of view, which makes us believe that all vampires are bad. Being bad is the rule. Twilight is told in first person, however, half of it is told by humans, human Bella, human Jacob, and half of it is told by vampires, vampire Bella, and in Midnight Sun, vampire Edward. Because of this, we really get to know the vampires and feel sympathetic towards them. In this series, it seems like most vampires are bad. Most of them feed on people, but there can be good vampires, although it does seem to be the exception. For the Vampire Diaries, the first couple opening seasons really focus on Elena. However, the later seasons turn into more of an ensemble. Therefore, we get both vampire and human points of view. In this series, I would say it's not that vampires are good or bad, it's that people are good or bad. And then when they turn into a vampire, that gets magnified. Finally, in the Mortal Instruments, we again have this theme that vampires can be good and bad depending on who they are. However, our only perspective through which we can look at vampires is through Simon, and he is not sympathetic towards vampires. He does not like being one, he doesn't like doing it, and because of that, it's harder for us to really sympathize with the vampires. Additionally, it's kind of portrayed that the vampires just stick to themselves, they don't interact with humans, whereas in the Vampire Diaries, vampires hang out with humans a lot, and they interact with them a lot. Lastly, we're going to talk about the main themes. These vampire books use vampires to get at their themes, but the themes that the vampires get at in these different books varies greatly. For instance, in Dracula, the main themes are female sexuality, modernity, Christianity, madness, money, otherness, and fear of outsiders. In Twilight, the themes that are explored are alternate societies where women are treated differently, maybe better, the female ideal, true love, and the idea of free will. In the Vampire Diaries, the main themes are brotherhood, true friendship, found family, and morality. And then finally, in the Mortal Instruments, I would say that the main themes are alliance, otherness, alienation, finding community, and self-acceptance. So there you have it. From Dracula to Twilight to the Vampire Diaries to the Mortal Instruments. Vampires have been portrayed in millions of different ways to make millions of different points, and I don't know about you, but I'm excited to see where vampire fiction goes from here. Let me know, do you have any thoughts on vampires throughout the ages? Any shows I should look into? Any books I should read? Let me know in the comments below. As always, thank you for listening. Hello! Hello! And then as they turn into a vampire, in the Vampire